Hello, and welcome on this MA course East meets West, Connections and Convergencies in Cold War and Post-Cold War Europe. My name is Marta Grzechnik. I am a professor of contemporary transnational history at the Center for Contemporary and Digital History of the University of Luxembourg. And today we welcome our guest lecturer, Assistant Professor Marta Grzechnik, who will give a guest lecture titled Region Building in the Baltic Sea Region During and After the Cold War, a Historian's Perspective. In this lecture, she looks at the Baltic Sea region in the 20th century, especially during the Cold War and its aftermath. She focuses on the various ideas and projects of region building that appeared around the Baltic Sea during that time and examines their success or lack thereof. In doing so, she deals with the questions of the changes and limitations of region building, the creation of collective identities, and the diffusion of ideas across the region, and puts them in the context of the legacies of the Cold War in Eastern Europe, but also more long-term paths of historical development of both Eastern and Northern Europe. Marta Grzechnik is an assistant professor at the Institute of Scandinavian and Finnish Studies at the University of Gdańsk in Poland. She is an historian with research interests in the Baltic Sea region and Northern Europe, borderland studies, regional history, and colonial history. She obtained her PhD in history from the European University Institute in Florence in 2010. In 2012 until 2016, she was a postdoctoral research in the program Baltic Borderlands, Shifting Boundaries of Mind and Culture in the Borderlands of the Baltic Sea Region at the University of Greifswald in Germany. And in 2018-2019, she was a German Kennedy Memorial Fellow at the Minda de Gunzburg Center for European Studies and a visiting fellow at Weatherhead Research Cluster on Global Transformations, both at Harvard University in the United States.
Good morning, my name is Marta Grzechnik from the University of Gdańsk in Poland. Today I would like to say a few words about the Baltic Sea region during and after the Cold War from the point of view of a historian. But first I would like to say a few words about the starting point for my research in the Baltic Sea region, its history and historiography. So first of all, I grew up on the Polish Baltic Sea coast, so this interest in the Polish relation to the Baltic Sea is something that came quite naturally to me. And on the other hand, I also have background in Scandinavian studies and I lived in Stockholm for a while, so I found it also interesting how the views from those two different shores of the Baltic Sea corresponded to each other and also differed from each other. My research started from the enthusiasm of the 1990s, so the time when many people started to think about the Baltic Sea region. And this is directly related to the subject of your course, that is the Cold War, or rather, more precisely, to its end. As I studied this topic, I realized that this relationship is more complicated than I had thought, as I will try to present today. And this presentation is going to make a kind of loop. I'll start with the time after the Cold War, then take a step back to the time of before the Cold War, so the interwar period, then the Cold War, and I'll come back to the post-Cold War period. So in reality, this is more about the aftermath of the Cold War than the Cold War itself. But first of all, some methodological remarks. Writing history for something other than the nation state is not an obvious choice, or at least it didn't seem so for most of the 19th and 20th centuries. And the end of the 20th century brought some important changes in this regard. So, first of all, it brought the end of the Cold War, which also resulted in more integration, more mobility of people's ideas and goods, and it was, of course, also seen in the framework of the wider process of globalization. And it all resulted in some arguments about the decreasing usefulness of the nation state as the main unit of historical analysis. There were some expectations that the time of the nation state would soon be over, so it will be soon replaced by networks spreading beyond state borders, its functions will be taken over by other frameworks, and its power taken over by other levels of governance, both higher and lower, so local, regional, transnational, and global. And in research, it was reflected by the development of new approaches that focused on transfers, exchange, connections, circulation, and multi-sided flows of influences. That was supposed to better depict this new kind of world and its new ways of thinking about human societies and about their connections. So some of those approaches were, for example, borderland studies, transnational and cross-national studies, or cross-national histories. As you can see here on the slide, they were supposed to seek to understand reciprocal influences as well as the ways in which the act of transplantation itself changes the topic under study. And some related approaches were, for example, Transfergeschichte, so history of transfers, or Histoire croisée, entangled history. They all looked at the past as a dynamic process of many-sided interactions that bring changes to all the sides of those interactions, the process itself, and also the observer of the process, that is the researcher. They also bring the change to the researcher, his or herself. And another way to address this belief in the crisis of the nation state was to choose the arena in which the processes of interaction take place. So this no longer had to be the nation state. What started to be studied were peripheries of the nation state, parts of the nation state, relations across its borders, but also regions, which started to be seen as alternative units of analysis. So historical regions were seen as those networks of interaction and transfers, and their histories were seen as transnational. And sea regions are a special case of this. Sometimes the study of sea regions was called thalassology, or is called thalassology. It had its origin in Fernand Brauddel's famous work from 1949 about the Mediterranean Sea. It was recalled also in this post-Cold War period. So seas and oceans are seen here as virtually epitomes of interactions and transfers, of networks combining shores, cultures, port towns, and with their connections to world and global history. That were seen as a especially fitting topic for regional history. And Baltic Sea region history is a combination of all these trends. It is a transnational sea region. It was directly affected by the fall of the Iron Curtain and the integration that followed. So it became quite popular in the 1990s. It became a favorite unit of historical analysis. There was this proposition that past connections and networks, such as trade and dynastic links, political, social, and economic processes, they all could get the scholars' full attention only now, after eliminating the harsh political division and discarding the nation-state bias. So they could thus be fully explored, creating a historical narrative of an entirely new kind. And you can see here on the slide several publications that came out of this approach. So first of all, David Kirby's 2 volumes of the history of the Baltic Sea region. Matti Klinge's, the Finnish approach to the Baltic Sea region, or the Baltic world, as he called it. And especially interesting for me is, I think, is this the book by Christian Jerner and Claes-Göran Karlsson from Sweden, called Nordens Medelhav, Östersjöområdet som historia, myt och projekt. So the Mediterranean of the North, which also shows us this idea of the Baltic Sea region as being somehow a Mediterranean sea between the land masses. So these are all just some examples. And also another interesting thing is that, for example, Scandinavians, especially Swedes, started calling this the sea a moat or a connecting link. So a moat, it was to be during the Cold War, and in the times before and after the Cold War, it was supposed to serve as a connecting link. So this metaphor quite nicely also reflected this idea of connectivity that had been interrupted by the Cold War. And there was an idea as well that historical region doesn't need to be defined as a region in space. So it was not defined by geographical, political criteria or hard borders, but instead it was seen as an arena of processes, a region in time. And an example of such a definition is quoted here on slide. by a German historian working in Poland currently Jörg Hackmann, who distinguished several of those processes that make up a historical region, and specifically the Baltic Sea historical region. So these were trade, large structures of power emerging from sea traffic, communication across the sea, the importance of medieval colonization, the influence of Christianity and the Reformation, the tension between coastal regions and the emerging territorial states, the formation and transformation of states and nations in the 19th and 20th centuries, as well as the collective memory of the 20th century. As you perhaps noticed, there is a thing that is characteristic of these processes. They are all peaceful processes, or comparatively peaceful. They rely on cooperation and connectivity and connections. So this regional framework, what was characteristic of it, it was also seen as an alternative to the nation state, in the sense that the nation state was blamed for the wars, the big wars of the 20th century. So it could be a better framework that would be able to overcome the conflicts and the wars of the 20th century. But also this shows us that this approach of history relies not only on remembering history, but also on forgetting some parts of the history. So history is, in a way, a toolbox from which we can choose different parts that are useful to our current goals. Those border-defining categories of the region were not only the object of research, but also its result, in the sense that they created a network of transfer of ideas. So some common regional concepts between scholars led to increased scholarly cooperation across borders. And these are some examples, again, of emerging networks in the 1990s, but also later, several programs. Just some examples, for example, Östersjöstiftelsen or the Baltic Sea Foundation in Stockholm, Center for Baltic and Eastern European Studies, or CBIS, at Södertörn Högskola in Stockholm, Visby scholarships founded by the Swedish Institute and aimed at Baltic Sea Region countries, the Baltic University program in Uppsala, or the interdisciplinary research training group Baltic Borderlands at the University of Greifswald in Germany, in northern Germany. And I've been myself involved in both CBs and Baltic Borderlands, so I've also been part of these networks. So these programs and initiatives created new entanglements in the region, which to an extent transformed both the object of the research, so the region itself, and the researchers. In this way, the region became the arena of transfers and entanglement, and the very tangible manifestation of this histoire was the proposition of the object of study changing the one doing the studying, so us, the researchers. So the region was transformed in the sense that, to a certain degree, it had to be talked and written into existence, to use the expression of Ivar Neumann, the Norwegian political scientist. So regional scholars, among others, assumed the task of region builders, which were not only political actors, as Neumann postulated, and they were responsible for providing a common identity based on, among other things, the common past. How successful they were in this task is a matter of debate, of course, but it has to be said that the region has been created in the sense of creating a conceptual framework. It has become an established unit of scholarly reflection and analysis, a frame of reference for projects and research in different fields, also conferences, cooperation, summer schools, summer universities, etc., etc. So the pool of possible and popular subjects has been changed to include the Baltic Sea region. And in the sense, also the researchers were transformed. So their networks and connections of academic cooperation and their ways of conceptualizing their objects of study. And the very fact of us talking right now about the Baltic Sea region is this process of talking it into existence. So we are doing it, or I am doing it right now. So as we can see that this post-Cold War enthusiasm brought a legacy, or was brought by the legacy of both the Cold War and the world wars of the 20th century. But there are also other legacies that, to some extent, form the limits to those networks and borders, which turn out not to be so easy to overcome. So setting out to map up those networks of connections that were formed in the region beginning from the early 1990s, one soon notices that it does not cover the whole of the region. So the cooperation, the joint programs, and the series of events appeared mostly on the northwestern shore of the sea among Nordic and northern German scholars, with an addition of those from beyond the region altogether, for example, the UK. However, it is difficult to find their colleagues from the post-Soviet countries of the southern and southeastern shores of the Baltic Sea. And this might seem surprising. Firstly, because it were firstly those countries that underwent the deepest change at the turn of the 1980s and 1990s, that they were most affected by the liberation of the time. So for them it was on one hand a political liberation, allowing them among other things to travel and make contacts with researchers and institutions around the Baltic Sea, but also on the other hand it was liberation from restrictions imposed on scholarships and on its methodology. Secondly, it is also surprising because it was precisely on the southeastern shore where the attempts at Baltic Sea cooperation and research had been made earlier in the 20th century, first of all in the interwar period. For example, the Baltic states had in the early 1920s proposed a Baltic League, which was a project of close cooperation within the region, but it was never taken up by the Scandinavian countries and it eventually failed. In Poland, for example, in the 1920s, a Baltic Institute was founded. That was a research institution that promoted Baltic Sea research in different fields of political science, economy, geography, history, etc. And there was also a first step made by this exact institution, a step towards an exchange of ideas. Namely, they founded a journal in 1935. It was first called Baltic Countries, a survey of the peoples and states on the Baltic with special regard to their history, geography, and economics. And later in 1937, it changed names to Baltic and Scandinavian countries. Another example, in 1937 in Riga, a Congress of Baltic Historians took place. That was called the First Congress of Baltic Sea Region Historians. And participants came from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, and Germany. So it was quite a lot from around the Baltic Sea. And during this Congress, the president of the International Committee of Historians, Michel Derrida, put forward a vision of a Baltic Sea community. He spoke about it as a common homeland. So we can say that these were the first attempts to talk the Baltic Sea region into existence. Baltic Sea region and its cooperation could be seen as a new framework for those, especially for those newly independent states of the region. So the Baltic states, that is Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and Poland, and Finland to some extent. So this new regional framework could be for them a way to break with defining them as parts of the old empires that they broke free from. But these projects were not very successful. One factor why this didn't happen was the skepticism of the Nordic partners, but also, of course, the growing political threats of the 1930s and eventually the outbreak of the Second World War and the Cold War that followed. Of course, when the Cold War was going on, it was quite difficult to be optimistic about the Baltic Sea cooperation. The Cold War meant mostly isolation, limited cooperation also among scholars. And for example, in Poland, here's an example from Poland, where the Baltic Sea area was used for national goals to construct a national narrative supporting the change of borders, because the borders of Poland were quite significantly changed after the Second World War. For example, German colonialism and settlement on the Baltic shores was seen as aggression. That came also from an older tradition in historiography. And following that, a scholar of so-called Western studies, studies about Polish Western territories, Zygmunt Wojciechowski, he had this idea of developed this idea of the homeland of Poland, which was supposed to be the original Polish territory. And this territory you can see on the map from his book from 1947, Poland, Germany, the 10 Centuries of Struggle. That was published in English, but also he developed it in other publications, also in Polish. These homelands of Poland, as you can see on this map, roughly corresponded with Poland post Second World War, minus the territories of East Prussia, but it was based on the shape of medieval Poland, and was strongly based on the Baltic Sea coast and the estuaries of Vistula and Oder, as well as medieval ports in Gdańsk and Szczecin. And by the way, a side note, it is quite interesting that there was quite a complex relation between those Western studies, Western scholarship, and the communist authorities, because they started from quite different points of departure, but they had common goals of securing the new Polish-Western border. And also another thing was that the communist authorities, at the beginning at least, they had no their own scholars or academics, so they, so to speak, had to make use of those that were there. And there is another interesting aspect of Polish Baltic research, which can already be seen in here. And I would like to bring your attention to the title of this book by Zygmunt Wojciechowski, Poland, Germany, 10th Centuries of Struggle, that shows us that this research had a very strong anti-German dimension, which was, of course, quite understandable given that this was published quite soon after the Second World War ended. But it was not a trend that was only limited from the direct after-war time. It was the Polish Baltic Sea Region scholarship and ideas in general have been traditionally anti-German, and they have been in dispute with the German scholarship and the German historiography. In turn, in the German historiography, Baltic Sea has traditionally been seen as the German sphere of influence, even sometimes called the German Sea in the 1920s, 30s, and later. Germans were seen there as bearers of culture, or Kulturträger. The merchants, town builders, clergy, knights, etc., they were all those German bearers of culture. And Germany established a series of institutes of Eastern studies, so Ostforschung, which also in part dealt with Baltic Sea region or Baltic Sea studies. And this antagonism was in part at least caused by the fact that the Polish access to the sea was a disputed territory between Germany and Poland, and both after the First World War and the Second World War, Polish access to the sea was carved out of the German territory. So as you can see here on this map, the green territory is the shape of Poland after the Second World War, so also currently. Those areas that are checked, these are the areas that were acquired from Germany or the Free City of Danzig after the Second World War. And there is this area here in the middle, which is the Polish access to the sea during the interwar period before the Second World War, so-called Polish or Danzig corridor, which also before the First World War had been a German territory. So as you can see, this is the reason why this territory was always throughout the 20th century disputed between Poland and Germany, and this is partly why the Baltic Sea scholarship was also in dispute between these two countries and their scholarships. But this gave the Polish Baltic Sea region concept always a certain sense of crisis, of having to defend Poland's access to the sea, especially against the German. Let us have a look now at the other shore of the Baltic Sea, at the Scandinavian or the Nordic region. I mentioned before that Scandinavia was quite skeptical towards the projects of Baltic Sea region cooperation in the interwar period. And of course, the Cold War wasn't a factor that would enable more cooperation from that side. And the skepticism of Scandinavians, or the Nordics more widely, came from a combination of interlinked cultural and historical factors. One of them was a strong feeling of Nordic unity. And let us not forget that if we have such a strong identity in the region, like in the Nordic region, it does not only rest on what the Nordic is, but also what it is not. So it is also demarcating itself from the others, including the Baltic Sea neighbors who are not Nordic. And this factor was already present in the interwar period and continued to be so during the Cold War. Another factor was the fear of Russia or the USSR and the political instability that it could cause in the immediate vicinity. That was also already present earlier, already in the 19th century, but was made more visible during the Cold War. In Sweden, especially, it is traditionally called rysskräck, so we can translate it as a fear of the Russian or fear of Russia. So during the Cold War, also the Nordic states turned their attention to the building of welfare states, and apart from that being a series of political and social reforms, a political and social program, it also was an ideological statement and some kind of ideological weapon in the Cold War. It was often called the middle way between the Western and the Eastern blocs. So that was a kind of statement of difference from the rest of Europe. And in general, during the Cold War, the Scandinavian region quite clearly tried to distance itself from Europe. It created this image of an opposition between itself that was seen as modern, social democratic, Protestant, peaceful and neutral, as opposed to Europe, rest of Europe, that was conservative, capital-oriented, Catholic, involved in wars, both cold and conventional, as well as colonialism. So in a way, that was dealing with threats posed by the Cold War by just turning one's back on them. So, for example, Sweden, or in Scandinavia in general, had no enthusiasm for ideas of Baltic Sea Region cooperation that coming from the USSR, for example, the idea of Sea of Peace, that they saw as, probably rightly so, as an ideological tool of the USSR instead of a genuine attempt of to create cooperation in the region. Another way that it manifested itself was that the Scandinavian region was very much involved in the Third World, in line with the policy of neutrality, pacifism, keeping equal distance from the two blocs, while at the same time allowing themselves to forget about the past links with the Baltic states. On the other hand, there was also a movement of refugees throughout the Cold War, beginning from the Second World War, especially from Estonia, that came to the Nordic shores, especially to Sweden. In this context of the Cold War, I would like to also mention one quite interesting project that was put forward in 1977 by two Polish geographers, Jerzy Zaleski and Czesław Wojewódka, who that year published a book called Europa Bałtycka, zarys monografii gospodarczej, or Baltic Europe, an outline of the economy. And according to the authors, their interest in the Baltic Sea region, or as they call it, Baltic Europe, came from the fact that it had become the center of attention during that time, so late 1960s and in the 1970s. And some examples of how it came to the center of attention was that it had become an arena of peace processes. For example, in 1968, the seat of the World Peace Council was put in Helsinki, so in the Baltic Sea region. In 1975, the same city became the host of a conference on security and cooperation in Europe. Then, for example, Ostsee Gesellschaft was founded with seats in Hamburg and Stockholm in 1965, so again, cooperation in the region. Also, annual Baltic Sea Weeks in Rostock, so in Eastern Germany, were organized. That was also a time of closer economic cooperation and also cooperation in the field of ecology, of saving of marine environments. For example, a convention on fishing and conservation of the living resources in the Baltic Sea and the Belts was signed on the 18th of September 1973 in Gdańsk. And in 1974 in Helsinki, a convention on the protection of the maritime environment in the Baltic Sea area. Another factor, there were also improved relation between Poland and Western Germany after a Treaty of Warsaw was signed in 1970, and following that, the Western revisionist voices were silenced. Just as a side note, revisionist voices in Western Germany were voices that were demanding the revision of the Polish-German border and giving back of those territories that had been given to Poland from Germany after the war. So all those factors, all those peace and cooperation processes and projects, they created a hope of peaceful cooperation and competition. So this time, the 1970s, was a time of relative hope, stability, and secure access to the sea. So the vision, because of that, the vision in this book is rather optimistic. Zaleski and Wojewódka write that they introduced for the first time the term Baltic Europe, by which the territory adjacent to the sea and having most vital bonds with it is understood. So there is this idea of cooperation and even a transnational approach to writing about the Baltic Sea. And in the 1990s, so this time of the regional enthusiasm that I described at the beginning, this idea of Baltic Europe was recalled. For example, in 1994, the Baltic Institute, this institution that had existed already in the 1920s, organized a conference called Towards the Community of Baltic Europe. However, during that conference, during the presentation and speeches made during this conference, there was really no connection to the ideas circulating in the northwestern Baltic Sea region at the same time. And paradoxically, this idea of the Baltic Europe in the 1990s became less hopeful, less optimistic than it had been in the 1970s, and less transnational. What could it come from? Well, there was a certain insecurity still in the face of changes. That was very soon after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. A strong sense of insecurity, Russian threat, but also, on a sense, also German and Western threat. The threat of powers, or the fear of powers making connections and agreements over the heads of the smaller nations, based on cynical, cool calculation, as it was called in one of the conference speeches. It was, of course, still not clear in which direction European politics would develop. So this traditional fear of German military aggression was replaced to some extent by fear of European communities' economic exploitation. However, access to the sea itself was not threatened during that time, so this maritime aspect became quite not that much in focus in that approach in the 1990s. The priority was securing national interests, so there was little interest in transnational approaches. And also another factor, some economic and linguistic difficulties made it difficult to join the international trends. Quite simply, people did not have so much money to travel and start and participate in those networks, and it was difficult because not everybody spoke good English or German or Scandinavian languages. Another factor which I would like to mention in this context is that not every country which borders on the Baltic Sea is equally Baltic, or its Balticness, so to speak, is equally strong. In other words, the identity of their identity is not equally Baltic. And this comes from, for example, the established intellectual and political traditions of the various nations, but also the fact that they can identify themselves more strongly with other structures, other frameworks of reference. For example, the Nordic region or the Scandinavian regions are much stronger than the identification with the Baltic. Or, on the other hand, for example, the Central Eastern Europe. Another factor is geographical location and the length of the shoreline, and also the size of a country in respect to the length of the shoreline. So, for example, some countries are just simply too big for the Baltic to be this very important part of their national identity, especially Russia, but also to some extent Germany and even Poland. And finally, the mental maps of the different nations do not include the Baltic Sea to the equal extent. For example, again, the example from Poland, in the interwar period after regaining independence and access to the sea, it was quite a discussion in Poland about how far Poles are a maritime nation, how are they connected, how much they are connected with the sea, the maritime culture, and so on. And this was discussed, among others, by this research institution that I already mentioned, the Baltic Institute. For example, in 1926, at the very beginning of its existence, its first director, Stanisław Srokowski, he wrote that the Polish seashore in our everyday concepts is still some distant borderland, not the country's lungs, an indispensable organ of its free existence. So his conclusion was rather sad that the Baltic Sea does not feature a lot on the mental maps of Poland. And in this way, we've come full circle back to the 1990s and the enthusiasm of the 1990s. And once again, we have to ask ourselves this question about making sense of the absence of transfers. Why was it that despite the enthusiasm of the 1990s and the hope to overcome the old divisions, there were in fact, as we have seen, two separate sets of projects with different assumptions and aims. So first of all, those divisions created in the 20th century are not so easy to overcome. The divisions created by both World Wars and the Cold War. Then there were, of course, practical difficulties, language, financing, as I mentioned before. But also there were different aims and different priorities. I've already spoken at the beginning about the aims and priorities of those transnational networks and approaches. But on the other hand, this other case of, for example, Polish approach in the 1990s, it was more nation-centric and threat-based than that of the other side of the sea. There was a strong sense of insecurity, a sense of vulnerable position with regard to neighbors, both Western and Eastern neighbors. And also an important factor that we have to remember about is this that the country just regained its full sovereignty. So the priority was strengthening of the nation state, not trying to overcome it. So in this way, approaches questioning the primacy of the nation state were not seen as attractive, and approaches based on transfer, crossings, or a region were not seen as useful alternatives because simply alternatives were not sought in the first place. So this is what stopped the spreading of ideas from the west and the north to the southeast of the Baltic Sea region. But how about in the other direction? Well, there was also not much success. There had been no interest in projects developed in the Central Eastern Europe in the INTERWAR period, those that I mentioned before, and they were quite soon forgotten. So that in the 1990s, when the idea of the Baltic Sea region gained popularity, it could be presented as, and indeed believed to be, new. And here we come to the question of divisions and hierarchies. So the Baltic space, as European space in general, is culturally divided into East and West. And this division is, first of all, is constructed, as argued most famously by Larry Wolff, who in 1994 published the book Inventing Eastern Europe, the map of civilization on the mind of the Enlightenment. He argued that this division of Europe into East and West was artificially created by the intellectuals of the Enlightenment. So that's where he puts the beginning of this division. Secondly, this division is also implicitly hierarchical. The West has in it the position of power, or as Maria Todorova has phrased it, Western Europe is the standard against which the rest has to position itself. And another feature, this division is older than the Cold War, and therefore it was not gone after it ended. As Larry Wolff put it, the Iron Curtain is gone, and yet the shadow persists. The shadow persists because the idea of Eastern Europe remains, even without the Iron Curtain. This is not only because the intellectual structures of half a century are slow to efface themselves, but above all because the idea of Eastern Europe is much older than the Cold War. As I mentioned before, in Larry Wolff's argument, it is older because it comes from the period of the Enlightenment. What I also find interesting is this metaphor of the shadow of the Iron Curtain, because the shadow is somewhere that we don't look. and we don't know what's there. Again, quoting Larry Wolff, in the shadow of the Iron Curtain, it was possible to imagine vaguely whatever was unhappy or unpleasant, unsettling or alarming, and yet it was also possible not to look too closely, permitted even to look away, for who could see through the Iron Curtain and discern the shapes enveloped in the shadow? This might explain why the spread of ideas was only one-sided, because the West did not look into the shadow. The West expects its ideas to spread, not to accept ideas from the East. It accepts to change the East. It expects to change the East, not to be changed by the East itself. This argument, of course, is even more strongly when we go out of Europe into the non-European world, and the question of Orientalization and colonialism and so forth. But this is, of course, not the subject of this particular lecture, although it's a very interesting topic in itself. So, for example, how it looked in practice. For example, the help to the Baltic states, that is Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, post-transition after the fall of the Soviet Union, was conditioned on adopting Nordic values and norms, and also learning to speak English, because somehow they had to communicate with the Nordics, and of course they were not ready to learn Russian, which had been the lingua franca of the region before. This has been called, for example, by Kazimierz Musiał, cognitive colonization. In a way, this idea of adapting Nordic values as a condition of help post-transition. So a region might be conceived as a network of transfers, as I explained at the beginning, yes, but these networks are not free of hierarchies. There are also blind spots, lack of knowledge, which does not come from unavailability of information, but rather from disinterest, which follows from the position of being a norm setter. In conclusion, we could say that this framework of the Baltic Sea region had only limited appeal. It had to compete with other regional and national networks, for example, in the north with Scandinavia, Nordic region, in the south with a region that is variously called Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, East Central Europe, and as you can see from all these names, it itself is a region of competing and contesting identities. The enthusiasm of the 1990s is long gone. That window has already closed. And it is very difficult to predict how the region will react to this very new situation that we find ourselves in right now. So first and foremost, the Russian aggression. We already see that Sweden and Finland are considering a NATO membership, so we can also ask ourselves, perhaps it will also mark a start of a new era of closer Baltic cooperation, or on the other hand, also a new form of Rus-Grek. Thank you very much.